مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. لا ضرائب بدون تمثيل نيابي. قبل أكثر من 200 عام غضب المستعمرون الأمريكيون غضبا شديدا لأن الملك فرض عليهم ضرائب بدون أن يعطيهم صوتا في البرلمان، لدرجة أنهم تمردوا في النهاية، مختارين أن يحاربوا لأجل الاستقلال في بلادهم. اليوم هذا الشعار نفسه، لا ضرائب بدون تمثيل نيابي، مطبوع على اللوحات ترخيص كل مركبات في عاصمة بلدنا واشنطن، ويرجع ذلك إلا أنه هنا أيضا يدفع 700,000 شخص في مقاطعة كولومبيا الضرائب، ولكن لا صوت انتخابي لهم، لا أعضاء في مجلس الشيوخ ولا نواب في مجلسنا التشريعي الوطني. ربما يتغير هذا الوضع. الرئيس بايدن والحزب الديمقراطي ملتزمان بتحويل واشنطن إلى ولايتنا ال51. ستكون صغيرة الحجم، ولكن ما يزال عدد سكانها أكبر من ولايتين الأخريين وايومنغ وفيرمونت. كيف صارت واشنطن المكان الوحيد في أميركا حيث لا يمكن للأمريكيين التصويت لانتخاب أعضاء مجلس الشيوخ والنواب الكونغرس؟ ما هي فرص أن تصير ولاية؟ لماذا يعارض معظم الجمهوريين الفكرة؟ لمناقشة ماضي مقاطعة كولومبيا وحاضرها ومستقبلها، يسرني أن أرحب بواحد من أشهر صحفي واشنطن، توم شيرwood. Welcome back to داخل Washington. There's a phrase in American history and American politics that draws on a baseball theme. Washington, first in war, first in peace, last in the American League. It is also our nation's capital, a wonderful, beautiful, throbbing city alive with residents who don't have a vote. How did it happen that our nation's capital has people with no vote in Congress, no representation here in our nation's legislature? To discuss the history of Washington, how it evolved, what the future may lie, perhaps our 51st state, I'm delighted to welcome one of Washington's most celebrated journalists, Tom Sherwood. Tom, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Robert. Happy to be here.
Tom, how did Washington, D.C. get created?
Well, the Americans in the 1700s defeated the British, and the legislature that was created to run the country first met in Philadelphia after 1776 and moved to Washington after 1790. They moved everything about the revolution except the right to vote.
And why did it create this national capital that was different than any other part of the country?
Well, part of the problem was that the Congress had been meeting in Philadelphia. And after the Revolutionary War, veterans of that war were very upset for one good reason. They were not being paid. So a big crowd of them went to Philadelphia and banged on the doors of Congress and threatened, had weapons, were threatening Congress, pay us or else. And Congress got very nervous. In the intervening years, it moved from Philadelphia to Trenton, New Jersey, to Annapolis, Maryland, even to New York City. And then ultimately, in an agreement that Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington agreed to, they chose 10 acres, 10 square miles of land along the Potomac River, which is now Washington, D.C., to create a capital that the Congress would control. And that's what they did.
So Congress controlled it, not the people who live in the city. Is that right?
That is correct. Initially, when the District of Columbia was created, people who did in fact live in the Virginia portion of it and the Maryland portion of it voted in their respective states. but later I want to check the right year, but some years thereafter, the Congress decided that the district needed to be 100% controlled by Congress, that a territorial government that it had set up had misspent money. That was a famous boss Shepherd who had spent a lot of money developing roads and sewage and things like that. They said they would just take it over. And they took it over and they made a 3-commissioner form of government that would make all the decisions for the people of Washington, D.C., and those people would have no vote in Congress.
So when Jefferson and Lincoln and Wilson lived here, the city was run by 3 commissioners appointed by Congress.
Yes, and that lasted until 1973. But, you know, even the people who could vote back at the beginning were men, white men, you know, women, and certainly African Americans who were not allowed to vote. So it's been a horrific beginning for what is supposed to be the shining light on the hill for democracy.
And just flash forward for a minute. Who lives in Washington today? Tell us a bit about the city.
We have a population of just about 700,000 people. It's in 68 square miles on the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia. We have people here who work for the federal government, and we have people here who don't even know where the federal government is. They live their own lives. They go to their own synagogues, their own mosques, their own churches. They go to their schools. They live in their neighborhoods. In other words, they are 100% Americans, except they have no vote in the Senate or in the House. They have a delegate who can only vote on occasion. And we certainly don't have statehood where we can decide the laws of our city. This little government that we have called the DC Home Rule Act, whatever the district does, let's say we wanted to put a Ferris wheel on Constitution Avenue, the Congress has to approve it. Every law that the District of Columbia passes locally, the Congress has 30 days or more in which it can say, we don't like that law. Now, to Congress's credit, they have not intervened as much as they used to, but it's still, we are subject to Congress, not voters in Congress.
So home rule means that whatever the DC Council approves as a city council, actually some congressman from Arizona or Alaska or Maine or Florida gets to have a say in whether it really becomes law?
Any member of Congress can raise his or her hand and say, I don't like that. And then there will have to be a hearing by appropriate committees before the bill goes forward. And again, in the Senate, there's no one representing the District of Columbia's 700,000 people in the United States Senate.
And so who was the first person elected mayor of the city of Washington?
Well, in modern times, that was Walter Washington in 1974. Boss Shepherd, as I mentioned earlier, was the person appointed to run the city and ran it into the ground. But Walter Washington, a distinguished housing activist, was appointed by Lyndon Johnson, the president, in 1968.
All right. When we come back after the break, Tom, I want to discuss the debate over statehood itself. Okay. Who is advocating for it? What are the pros? What are the cons? And what are the possibilities that Washington becomes the 51st state? In just a moment. July 4th has arrived, and what a July 4th this is. This Independence Day is a day for millions of Americans to celebrate their freedom from COVID, not just the 245th anniversary of America's Declaration of Independence. That means picnics and parades, baseball games, and lots of fun. And when it's time to wind down at the end of the day, putting your feet up to watch a film. If you're looking for an appropriate Independence Day film to watch, here are 3, all of which are on my list of all-time favorites. Any list has to begin with Independence Day, the iconic 1996 film in which Will Smith and Jeff Goldblum improbably help America and the world defeat an attack by space aliens. My favorite part is the 5 seconds when the Egyptian and Israeli air forces team up to do battle against the bad guys. Second is National Treasure, a terrific Nicolas Cage action flick in which an invisible treasure map is hidden on the back of the Declaration of Independence. And third is 1776, the movie version of the drafting of the Declaration by Thomas Jefferson that was made into a fantastic Broadway show. Every one of these is a feel-good film that will end your 4th of July with a lump in your throat and a smile on your face. Again, my guest today is Tom Sherwood. Tom is best known as the leading authority on the people and politics of the city of Washington, the living, breathing entity of 700,000 people within the 68 square miles that holds our nation's capital. A print, radio, and television journalist for more than 50 years. No one knows more about this city and its politics than Tom Sherwood. So, Tom, when did the call for statehood begin?
In the earliest days, there were people who were saying that the people in the District of Columbia should retain their voting rights in Maryland and Virginia, the neighboring states from which the city was created. But it wasn't really until after the there were various efforts back in the early 1900s when voting rights for women and other issues would come up. People say, well, what about the people in the District of Columbia? What about them? What about them? It wasn't really until the 1960s with the civil rights activism of that year and the violence of the civil rights riot in 1968 after the killing of Martin Luther King, that people would point to this majority African-American District of Columbia and say, why are the Americans in the District of Columbia not in charge of their own affairs, and why don't they have voting rights, and why aren't they statehood? And so it's just been a series of events. I've told people it's kind of like a popcorn popper, if that's not too colloquial to describe, that every now and then issues pop up. We should have voting rights. We should have statehood, and then it kind of dies down, and then a couple more years it comes up. Right now, we have the best chance ever for the district to become the 51st state, although it's a very difficult battle in the United States Senate. It may take getting through the 2022 congressional elections to get more favorable members of the Senate for it to even happen then.
And explain the process. How would the District of Columbia become a state?
Well, beyond the initial 13 states that created the Union, the Congress has admitted all the other states by a majority vote into the Congress, as states into the Union. And so what we've been trying to do, the big debate is, can Congress simply vote to pass statehood for the District of Columbia, carving out a little 2-mile area for the federal district, which would still be controlled by Congress, but the rest would become a state? Or the battle is, does the district have to be admitted through a constitutional amendment? And the District of Columbia people say no. Congress has full legislative authority over the district, and under the Constitution, it can admit the District of Columbia, minus the federal section, as a state. Others say no, it has to go to a congressional constitutional amendment, which must be approved by 37 states around the country. And that's just what happened.
And for that, who makes the ultimate decision? Is that the Supreme Court?
Well, we think the Supreme Court ultimately would get into it. Let's assume the best case for the District of Columbia. After all these years of being in the hinterland of voting rights and statehood, let's assume that after the 2022 elections, there are enough votes in the House and the Senate to make the District of Columbia a state. The first thing that would happen is Republicans would go to court and sue and say that the Congress doesn't have the authority to make the district a state, and it must be by a constitutional amendment. Now, and you can understand why the Republicans, while they should be for voting rights and one vote, so one person, one vote, and all the good things about statehood, they have to worry because the Senate right now is 50-50 in terms of Republicans and Democrats. This is a very liberal city. If the District of Columbia were to become a state, the 2 senators who would be elected by the people of the district most assuredly would be moderate liberal or even liberal senators. And that would be a nightmare for the Republicans. So recently, when the Senate held its first hearing on statehood in like 7 or 8 years, the Republicans on the committee in the Senate said this is a power grab. All the elite people who live in Washington simply want to grab statehood so they can get their way as Democrats and help the Senate pass laws that the Republicans don't like. So we've got a political issue. It's just a matter, there will be a huge legal battle afterwards. And the Supreme Court, which is, I'm trying to say this carefully, the Supreme Court, which is now basically conservative, 6-3 in terms of the members, could easily say that Congress has the authority to create the states, and so it created the District of Columbia. Or it could say this is a constitutional matter, and therefore it must go through a constitution amendment process. So we're not going to wake up in the next couple of weeks, months, and maybe even years and find that our little District of Columbia is a state.
Are there options of doing a deal to make this happen? I mean, if the Republicans are upset about two more Democratic senators, are there ways to address these concerns?
Well, in the past, 2 jurisdictions have been admitted at the same time to do a political balance. I happened to be a young person in 1959 in Hawaii, when Hawaii and Alaska were allowed to become states at the same time because they would balance each other as Republican and Democratic leaning states. Of course, in the meantime, those 2 states have switched their allegiances. So there is some suggestion that the District of Columbia could become a state in tandem with Puerto Rico, which is a territory of the United States. And it could become a state, the district could become a state, and that might balance out the politics. But after the hurricanes and all the recent politics of Puerto Rico, I don't know that would still stay. I think you're going to have adamant 100% opposition by Republicans to the District of Columbia becoming the state because they see it as their place. They don't see it as a state, and they don't like the politics of giving Democrats more votes.
And any talk about maybe just giving most of the district back to Maryland and Virginia as a solution for this issue?
Well, in 1846, the part that was from Virginia was retroceded to Virginia. And that was in part because Virginia was worried that the District of Columbia was going to outlaw slavery, and Virginia was not ready to outlaw slavery. Now we have the portion of the land that was ceded to the district by Maryland. And some people think, well, let's just make you part of Maryland. And you can vote for the governor there, you can vote for the senators, and you can have the voting rights that you so desperately desire. There's one problem, well, there are 2 problems with that. One, the people of Washington, we are a unique entity. We want to be our own state. And 2, no one in authority in any way in Maryland wants to take on the District of Columbia. Could you imagine being the mayor of Baltimore or the governor of the state and suddenly have 400, 500,000 more voters enter into Maryland? We would become the biggest jurisdiction in Maryland, and we would take over Maryland state politics. The Congress can't just give this land back to Maryland. Maryland would have to agree to take it, and I know of no one of substance in Maryland who says, we'll take it. It's not going to happen.
All right, so we only have a few seconds left. You've been looking at this topic, covering it for decades. What's your prognosis? Will DC become the 51st state?
I want you to know, as a district citizen, I have lived here full-time since 1974. I was here in the Navy in 1968. I saw the King riots. I would say, as a citizen of the district, I am for statehood. I am for full voting rights as an American citizen. As a journalist, I look at it and the hurdles that I have just described about Republicans, about the people not knowing who the District of Columbia really is or what it is. I think it's going to be very difficult. I don't think we'll get a vote we might get a vote in the Senate this year, but there's a real debate about whether you should have a vote if you think you're going to lose it, or should you just wait till after the 2022 elections, national elections. The problem there is if the Republicans take back either the House or the Senate, statehood again is dead for the near future. So it's a very iffy chance that we will become a state, even though for racial justice issues, for citizen rights, for participation in the full experience that is America, for making a more perfect union, it's going to be very difficult.
Tom Sherwood, thank you so much for explaining the politics of the District of Columbia to our viewers throughout the Middle East. I first visited Washington, D.C. in 1966. I was 4 years old, and my family piled into our old station wagon and drove from our home in Rhode Island to our nation's capital. From my vague recollection, the trip was a bit like a biblical pilgrimage to see the hallowed sites of America's secular religion. In those days, one dressed up in one's finest clothes to romp around the hills of Mount Vernon, play in the marble halls of Congress, or if you were really lucky, and we were, to sit at the base of the pillars that held up the White House. In elementary school, I took a 5th grade class trip to Washington, my second visit. The lasting memory from that trip was when the hat blew off the head of one of my classmates at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington Cemetery, and he instinctively ran into the enclosed area to fetch it. At that point, a uniformed guard in full dress regalia barked, "Halt!" and pointed his ceremonial rifle at my friend. All's well that ends well, but it was a memory I will never forget. 7 years later, in 1979, I came to D.C. for the 3rd time on a trip sponsored by the Close-Up Foundation that brings high school kids to Washington from all across the country to see our political and policymaking process close up. Among all the brilliant politicians we met, I still remember a briefing from one especially wonderful journalist, Cokie Roberts, that laid bare some of the reality behind the luster of Washington. Sadly, Cokie passed away 2 years ago. And then in 1985, I moved to Washington after completing my master's degree at Harvard. And despite stints in England, Cameroon, and Morocco, I have never really left. The DC area is my home. My kids have known no other. I say all this to explain that over more than 50 years, I have seen Washington as a place to visit, as a place to work, as a place to live. I appreciate why it is our nation's capital, with an identity separate and distinct from the other 50 states. And I know firsthand the city as a living entity where hundreds of thousands of ordinary Americans live their lives as Americans do everywhere in our country. The time has come to recognize both these facts, to preserve something about Washington that is unique and distinct, and to provide its residents with the same rights and privileges that Americans everywhere enjoy. This is doable. I hope our legislators and our leaders get it done. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول الانقسام العميق بين الديمقراطيين والجمهوريين في السياسة الأمريكية، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.